In 2017, a 17-year-old girl vanished from her grandmother's house in rural Kentucky. Her phone was later found shattered in the woods, its screen gone black. Some neighbors swore she had simply run away. Others whispered about a family feud that never died. For weeks, the search turned up nothing but silence until her diary surfaced. Pages crowded with prayers, sketches of an old bridge, and references to blood spilled 4 decades earlier. The facts pointed to violence, but the community leaned toward curses, rituals, and rumor. In the end, the diary would speak louder than anyone imagined, transforming from a private notebook into the centerpiece of a courtroom. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from today. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. The last days of September in eastern Kentucky carried a damp chill that settled into the earth long before nightfall. The mountains rose close around the town, their slopes already touched with the yellow of early autumn. And in the valley, the houses seemed to huddle tighter as the evening shadows stretched. At her grandmother's house on the edge of town, 17-year-old Emily Carter prepared to step outside. She pulled on a light jacket, the same denim one she wore on cool evenings, and told her mother she would be back before dark. The details of that departure, recalled later in fragments, would become the first cracks in a story that widened with each retelling. Some swore they saw her walk down the gravel drive. Others insisted she lingered by the porch, uncertain. Mary Carter remembered glancing at the clock in the kitchen. It was just past 5 p.m. Emily's shoes remained neatly by the door, the laces looped together as if she had slipped out in a hurry or perhaps with the thought of returning quickly. The television was on low in the background, but the sound of the screen barely registered as Mary looked toward the empty yard. She assumed her daughter had gone to the neighbor's house or wandered to the store at the edge of town. There was nothing unusual in that moment, yet the silence that followed grew heavy enough to press on every breath. By 7 p.m., with dusk spilling across the ridge, Mary stepped outside and called Emily's name into the thickening dark. The porch light flickered once, then steadied, illuminating the gravel drive where no answer came. A neighbor returning from town with groceries thought he had glimpsed a slim figure on the road, walking fast, head down. That single uncertain memory shaped the first theory. Emily had run away. When the sheriff's office was called, volunteers gathered quickly. Flashlights pierced the woods. Dogs were led on leashes through underbrush, and voices echoed through the hollows. The community had seen searches before. Missing hunters, lost children straying too far into the trees. But this felt different. There was no laughter to lighten the tension, no casual remark that she would turn up soon. The beams of light swept across wet leaves and tree trunks until, near the back gate of the Carter property, someone noticed faint impressions pressed into the damp earth. Small, shallow, almost blurred by time. They might have been made by Emily, or by another girl of her age, or by no one at all. The ground seemed to have swallowed them before they could lead anywhere. Inside the house, Mary walked through her daughter's room with a hand pressed against the doorframe. The bed was unmade, the lamp still warm. A comb lay across the dresser with strands of auburn hair caught between its teeth. On the nightstand rested a leather-bound diary, its cover softened by use. The book was open to a page where the ink trailed into silence. "I think they will never forgive." The unfinished sentence hung there like a breath cut short. Mary closed the diary without meaning to, as if shutting it might close the distance opening in her chest. Rumor spread quickly in a town this small. Some leaned toward the ordinary explanation, a restless girl who chose to leave, who might be seen again in Lexington or Louisville, working at a diner or living with friends. Others whispered about older wounds, the feud that once divided the Carter and Boyd families, a quarrel stretching back 40 years to a night of violence few wanted to recall. At the gas station the next morning, men muttered that history never truly ends in a place like this. Sheriff Douglas Harmon avoided speculation. He stood in the yard under the pale beam of his flashlight, studying the faint tracks. They angled toward the road, but not in a straight line. There was hesitation in them, as though whoever left them had turned back and forth, uncertain. Harmon ordered the ground marked and photographed, though the images later showed little more than smudged shapes dissolving into mud. The search stretched deeper into the woods. Branches snapped underfoot, beams of light cutting through the thinning leaves. A broken beer bottle glittered in the brush, and a volunteer dropped it into a bag, thinking it might matter. Hours later, it would be dismissed as trash left by hunters. The dogs barked once, then fell quiet. Rain began to fall in a thin mist, dampening coats and hair, erasing whatever impressions had remained on the ground. By midnight, the house had filled with relatives. Styrofoam cups of coffee lined the counter. Maps were unfolded across the kitchen table, with circles drawn around creek beds and ridges. Yet Mary's eyes kept drifting to the diary. She opened it again, running her finger across the half-written line. To her, it did not read like the musings of a runaway. It read like a warning. The words blurred as her tears struck the page. Outside, rain pattered against the windows, each drop dissolving into the night. Volunteers drifted back with mud on their boots, their faces weary. They offered reassurances they did not believe. The diary remained on the table, its cover darkening where water had smeared the ink. No one touched it again until morning. The final sentence ended mid-stroke, swallowed by unfinished ink. The morning after the disappearance broke gray and heavy, the hills tucked beneath low clouds that seemed to press down on the town. The Carter house smelled of burnt coffee and damp clothes hung by the stove. Volunteers had returned before daylight, their boots leaving streaks of mud across the porch. Mary Carter sat at the kitchen table, staring at the diary again, the line unfinished on the open page. She had barely slept. Every sound of the wind outside carried with it the thought of her daughter's footsteps. Sheriff Harmon expanded the search that day, widening the radius beyond the family's property. Deputies fanned out along the creek, some moving through pastures where cattle stood silent in the mist. Others took the old logging road that curved toward the highway. By mid-morning, a shout went up from the brush. A deputy held a phone high in his gloved hand, the screen spidered with cracks. The case was muddy, the battery dead. The phone had been found wedged between two stones, as if pressed there by accident. When Mary was shown the phone, she reached out as though touching it might pull her daughter back into the room. The forensic team noted a deep impact mark on the casing, consistent with a fall or deliberate strike against rock. It was logged carefully, sealed in a bag, and marked as evidence. The family clung to the detail that the device had been powered off, not drained. Someone, they thought, had ended whatever it held. Around town, belief moved faster than fact. A neighbor, old Mrs. Delaney, swore she had seen Emily the evening before, climbing into a pickup near the edge of town. She repeated it to anyone who would listen at the post office, and soon the idea spread. Emily had left willingly. Others shook their heads, muttering that the girl had been curious about the feud between her family and the Boyds, and curiosity had pulled her into something darker. Rumor wound through every conversation, louder than the official statements coming from the sheriff. Detective Helen Moore, sent down from the state police, arrived late in the afternoon. She walked the property slowly, noting small things. A gate left ajar, a set of tire ruts fading into grass near the fence line, the faint prints already smeared by rain. Moore picked up the diary with gloved hands, leafing through pages filled with neat handwriting. The words were not idle sketches. Some read like prayers, others like accusations. On one page, dated just weeks before, Emily had written about the fight that never ended, the names carved into memory. Another passage described the bridge over the river as if it were more than a landmark, as if it were part of a ritual. The dual threads pulled tighter. On one side were the whispers of a girl lured by old curses, bound to a bridge that locals called cursed. On the other were the hard fragments of evidence, a broken phone, blurred tracks, a diary filled with lines that hinted at fear. Both threads began to twist around each other, making it harder to see where belief stopped and fact began. By evening, the Carter living room had become a gathering place. Maps were spread across the coffee table, photographs pinned with thumbtacks. and volunteers circled with quiet determination. Some spoke of searching the abandoned quarry, others of walking the riverbanks by lantern. Mary said nothing. Her eyes stayed fixed on the diary resting beneath plastic, sealed away yet still speaking. She whispered the last words aloud once more, as if repeating them might force the ending to reveal itself. Outside, the mist thickened until the world seemed cut in half. Flashlights bobbed in the distance, moving slowly across the fields. The phone lay in an evidence bag, its screen fractured into dark veins, reflecting back the dim light of the sheriff's lantern. The night closed in around the Carter home, heavy and unbroken. And on the table, the diary's open page looked as though the words themselves had been smudged into silence, as if the voice that wrote them had been swallowed whole. The ink lay blurred, the sentence collapsing into a shadow of itself. The search pushed deeper into the hills on the third day, lantern light weaving between the trees as the sun disappeared behind the ridge. The ground was soft from rain, and each boot sank into mud that gave no answers. At the edge of the Carter property, an old man waited on his porch, smoking a thin cigarette that glowed against the dusk. His name was Franklin Boyd, a figure whose presence alone reminded the town of wounds older than Emily herself. Franklin called out to the deputies, telling them to come closer. His voice carried the rough edge of whiskey, and when they gathered near, he told a story. In 1977, he said, there had been a fight in a bar that left blood on the floor and men carried out on stretchers. He claimed he was there, that he saw a Carter blade flash in the neon light, and that the feud had never ended. His words hung like smoke, shaping the night with old grudges. To some listeners, it sounded like a warning that the past had returned to claim the present. Rumor spread quickly from that porch. People at the diner spoke of curses, of debts never paid, of violence that would always circle back to the young. Some said Emily had been drawn to the bridge because of it, because she wanted to see the place where the feud was sealed. To others, Franklin's story was nothing more than the rambling of a man looking to keep old wounds alive. Detective Moore listened in silence, then turned her attention to the archives at the county office. There, she unearthed a box of yellowing files, police reports, sworn statements, photographs curled at the edges. One Polaroid, faded to brown and green, showed the aftermath of the fight. The image was blurred, but a knife lay on the tile floor, its blade stained dark. The photo was logged in 1977, sealed in the file, and forgotten for decades. Moore pinned the photo to her notes, its edges crumbling under her touch. Back at the Carter house, Mary clutched the diary as if it were a lifeline. She flipped to a page where Emily had scribbled fragments of an old folk song, a tune sung at funerals in the hills. The words were written as if they carried meaning beyond music, as if Emily had believed they held the key to something buried. To Mary, it felt like a cry she had ignored. The dual story deepened. Franklin's memory of knives and blood in a bar against the tangible Polaroid pulled from county records. Belief and fact sat side by side, each one feeding suspicion. The diary, once dismissed as the private notes of a restless teenager, now looked less like musings and more like testimony. That night, a storm gathered. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder rolled down the hollows. Volunteers trudged through mud, lanterns nearly smothered by the downpour, their calls lost to the roar of water. In the Carter living room, the diary lay on the table between stacks of maps and photographs. The Polaroid rested nearby, the knife it captured frozen in time. Mary stared at the photograph until her vision blurred, then back at the diary where her daughter's handwriting wavered like a whisper. The storm rattled the windows, shaking loose leaves against the glass, and for a moment she thought she heard footsteps on the porch. But when she opened the door, only the storm answered, drenching her in cold rain. The Polaroid slipped from her hand, landing face up on the floor. The blade in the photo seemed to shimmer under the flicker of the overhead light, as though it had never truly been put away. The knife glowed faintly in the blurred edges of the old photograph. The storm that had torn across the valley left behind a silence even heavier than the night before. Roads were slick with runoff, and branches lay scattered across the yards. By mid-morning, the search regrouped, men and women tightening their jackets as they moved toward the river. The bridge, a rotting timber span long abandoned by the county, loomed ahead of them, its railings eaten through with rust, boards warped and broken. The place had been closed for decades, and yet people spoke of it as if it still drew breath. Hunters had passed through the night before, following deer into the thicket. One of them, a wiry man named Jesse McGraw, came forward now with something in his hand. It was a scrap of fabric, torn and damp, clinging to the jagged edge of a low branch near the bank. The color was pale blue. Mary Carter, when shown the piece, pressed it to her face and knew it belonged to her daughter's jacket. Detective Moore marked the location carefully. The branch was photographed, the fabric sealed in plastic. Under the bright glare of noon, the river looked brown and swollen, debris twisting in its current. The detail that struck her most was not the scrap itself, but what it carried. Faint flecks of paint, a faded red that did not match the jacket. When sent to the lab, the sample returned an odd confirmation. It was the same type of marking paint used by timber crews decades ago, the kind sprayed onto trees scheduled for felling. Rumor, however, was not slowed by science. Word spread that the river had taken Emily, the bridge demanding another body as it had once before. Neighbors spoke of lights seen drifting across the span at night, pale figures moving just out of sight. For every bagged piece of evidence, 3 new stories bloomed, each more elaborate than the last. Mary sat at her mother's kitchen table, the diary still wrapped in its plastic sleeve. She flipped to another entry, her eyes catching on a crude drawing, the outline of a bridge sketched in pencil, an X drawn beneath it. Around the edges, Emily had traced small shapes that looked like crosses, though one tilted sideways until it resembled something darker. To Mary, it was a map. To others, it was a ritual. Detective Moore held the drawing beside the piece of fabric, studying them in the dim light. The duality was stark, the community speaking in curses, the evidence whispering in fragments of paint and cloth. Which thread carried the truth was still uncertain, but both had begun to coil tighter around the same place, the bridge and the river beneath it. By late afternoon, the searchers gathered on the span itself. Boards sagged under their weight. Nails shrieked against rust. The air smelled of wet wood and iron. Beneath them, the water moved slow, catching against the pilings before sweeping away in dark swirls. Flashlights probed the riverbank, beams reflecting off glass bottles and rusted cans left from years past. Sheriff Harmon kept his eyes on the mud at the base of the pilings. He bent low, brushing aside leaves until a mark appeared, a groove pressed into soft earth, curved like the heel of a shoe. Another step lay beyond it, then another, before the trail vanished into water. It was impossible to know how old the impressions were. Still, he ordered them photographed, knowing that absence would haunt him more than uncertainty. That evening, back at the Carter home, the volunteers drifted away one by one. Only family remained, gathered in silence. Mary unsealed the diary once more. She read the entry aloud, her voice trembling over the lines. The bridge doesn't sleep. The bridge remembers. Outside the windows, mist rose from the ground where the rain still clung. The river could not be seen from the house, but its presence filled every corner, an unseen force pressing against the glass. Mary closed the diary, holding it against her chest as if the book itself might still be warm from her daughter's hands. Detective Moore stepped onto the porch before leaving, looking out toward the valley. She could hear the river, distant yet constant, carrying with it whatever secrets the bridge refused to release. The case files she carried felt light compared to the weight of what was forming in the town. The layers of belief, the growing suspicion, and the fragments of forensic evidence that only deepened the divide between them. That night, the bridge stood alone under a silver moon, boards shifting in the wind. From the highway, a driver slowed, swore he saw a figure on the span, arms outstretched. When he stopped to look again, the bridge was empty. The river whispered against the pilings, red paint glimmering faintly in the dark. The air grew colder as the week wore on, the kind of sharp Kentucky chill that seeped into bones long before winter. The Carter family's house had become both a command post and a shrine. On the refrigerator, search maps were taped beside snapshots of Emily, and the living room was crowded with relatives who never seemed to leave. They spoke in low voices, drinking endless cups of coffee, waiting for the next call from the sheriff's office. On the fifth night, Daniel Carter, Emily's older brother, descended into the basement of their grandmother's house. He had been asked to look for family documents, anything that might explain the diary entries Detective Moore had underlined. He lifted the lid of a cedar chest and found stacks of yellowed papers tied with twine. Among them was an issue of the county newspaper from 1977. Its headline was bold but water-stained: "Property feud erupts in violence." The article described a courtroom battle over a strip of farmland between the Carters and the Boyds. The case had ended in bloodshed when fists and knives carried the dispute from courthouse steps to a roadside tavern. Daniel spread the newspaper across the basement floor. The ink had bled in places, yet one column was still clear. It spoke of an unsanctioned ritual gathering near the river following the trial, a gathering where blood oaths were rumored to have been taken. Most dismissed it as sensational reporting, but the story had left its mark on the community. To Daniel, the words looked eerily similar to the passages Emily had copied into her diary. He carried the brittle paper upstairs, laying it out for his mother and Detective Moore. The detective studied the text carefully, circling names with a pen. The article named Emily's grandfather as a defendant in the dispute, his signature still legible on a photocopied deed. The forensic fact was clear. There had been a lawsuit, a verdict, a record that could not be erased. But wrapped around that truth was the rumor of ritual, a rumor still remembered 40 years later. Mary Carter touched the newspaper with trembling hands. For her, it was not a relic, but a wound reopened. She had grown up with whispers of that feud, though her father had kept details buried. Now, seeing his name in print, she realized Emily had been chasing ghosts that were all too real. In the following days, searchers shifted their focus back to the river. Some carried lanterns at night, tracing the waterline, hoping the current might give up what it had taken. Yet with each new circle of mud disturbed, more rumors rose. One woman claimed she had seen candles burning near the bridge long after midnight. Another said she heard chanting carried on the wind. None of it was proven, yet each tale spread faster than the sheriff's reports. Detective Moore cataloged the newspaper alongside the diary, building a picture of a girl who had been piecing together the fragments of her family's past. In her notes she wrote, "Symbol not private, symbol inherited." To her, the diary was shifting from a teenager's confidant to something larger, a ledger of history, a bridge between memory and evidence. By the end of the week, the Carter home felt less like a refuge and more like a watchtower. Windows were kept open at night as if listening for Emily's voice. Strangers appeared at the edge of the yard, leaving flowers or standing in silence before walking away. The line between prayer and investigation blurred. Mary sat at the table that evening, the diary and the newspaper side by side under a single lamp. Her hand hovered over Emily's handwriting, then over the old headline. The words seemed to echo each other, separated by decades, but bound by the same undertow. She wondered if her daughter had understood the danger she was chasing, or if she had simply wanted to know the truth. Outside, fog crept up from the river, swallowing fences and barns until only the glow of porch lights remained. The bridge, hidden in that mist, seemed closer than it was, as if the valley itself were folding inward. The ink on the old newspaper looked darker in the lamplight. The gash of a name crossed out with violent strokes. The mist did not lift the next morning. It hung low across the valley, clinging to fence posts and drifting into open fields until everything looked half submerged. Searchers moved through it with flashlights, even though the sun was already up, beams slicing white columns into the haze. In the Carter kitchen, silence lingered until the knock came. A young woman stood on the porch, her hair tied back, hands trembling as she introduced herself. Clara Boyd. She was 17 as well, barely older than Emily. Clara's family name alone made Mary stiffen, but the girl's voice carried urgency that broke through any hesitation. She said she had seen Emily the night she disappeared. They had spoken near the bridge, standing on the gravel pull-off just before the storm rolled in. Clara claimed Emily wanted to ask about the old feud, about what really happened in 1977, and that she had mentioned the diary. Clara repeated one line Emily had said aloud: "The bridge doesn't sleep." To some in the room, Clara's words felt like confession. To others, they were a cruel attempt to redirect suspicion. Sheriff Harmon questioned her carefully, but the answers remained vague. She admitted they had argued. About what, she would not say, and that Emily had walked away alone. She insisted she never followed. Detective Moore listened, noting details. When Clara mentioned exchanging messages with Emily, Moore requested access to her phone. The girl hesitated but handed it over. The SIM card revealed fragments of deleted texts. "Meet me at the bridge." "Have to know." "Not safe." The words carried weight, though none explained the end. By the time Clara left the house, rumor had already outpaced her testimony. Some said she had confessed to luring Emily into danger. Others whispered she had spoken of a light over the bridge, a pale flame that floated above the river before vanishing. In town, that image spread faster than the news of the text messages. Belief made its own path, and fact could not catch it. Mary Carter sat in the living room, the diary sealed in its plastic sleeve on the table. She turned to the page where Emily had written about Clara by name. She says the bridge is not quiet. She says it remembers. The handwriting shook at the end of the line, as though Emily had written in haste. Mary's fingers pressed against the sleeve, her breath fogging the surface. That night, volunteers gathered lanterns and returned to the bridge. The boards groaned beneath their weight as they leaned over the railing, light catching against the water's restless skin. Beneath the pilings, the mud was disturbed, small depressions forming what looked like the edges of a shallow hole. One man claimed he saw fresh earth piled to one side, as if someone had begun to dig and then abandoned it. The sheriff marked the spot for excavation the next day. Rain began to fall again, thin at first, then heavier, forcing the group back. As they walked away, one lantern blew out in the wind. In the sudden darkness, a voice swore he heard movement in the trees. But when the light was relit, nothing was there. Only mist, only the sound of water. Back at the Carter house, the diary lay open under the lamp. On a page no one had noticed before, Emily had drawn the outline of a pit, square and shallow, with a single line of text beneath. "The earth never stays closed." The words seemed to pulse in the silence of the room, as if the page itself carried breath. The unfinished sketch of a pit glimmered under the lamplight like a wound. The following morning, heavy machinery was brought down the narrow road that led to the river. The mist clung to the banks, swallowing the sound of diesel engines until they seemed far away, unreal. Sheriff Harmon ordered a cordon around the bridge. Deputies marked the perimeter with tape, keeping back the growing crowd of townspeople who had come to watch. Some carried thermoses of coffee, others only their curiosity. Whispers moved faster than the wind, claiming the dig would uncover proof of a ritual site, a place where oaths had once been sealed in blood. Detective Moore knelt by the muddy depression first noticed the night before. The earth was softer than it should have been, as though turned recently. She marked the edges, directing the team to dig carefully by hand. Shovels bit into the soil, lifting clumps that bled water. Within an hour, the dull thud of metal struck something solid. The diggers cleared around a box, metal corroded, edges eaten away by rust. It was small enough to carry, heavy enough to suggest it had been buried long. Gloves pulled it free, and under the gaze of dozens, it was lifted into daylight. Sheriff Harmon forced the lock, hinges groaning. Inside lay a collection of objects sealed in damp rot. A knife with a handle swollen from rust, a folded cloth darkened to brown, and a bundle of paper too sodden to unfold. The cloth was once white, now stained through, the smell of decay still clinging. The knife's blade, though corroded, showed its edge faintly, and even in ruin, it carried menace. Forensics later confirmed what suspicion already whispered. Traces of human blood lingered in the metal's grain, matched by database records to a case long closed. A victim from 1977, the fight Franklin Boyd had described. The crowd drew back as if the box itself breathed. Someone murmured that it was not evidence, but an offering. A remnant of an oath no one was meant to break. Others believed it proved everything the families had hidden for decades. Mary Carter, standing at the edge of the crowd, felt her knees weaken. She had seen sketches in Emily's diary of a knife with lines around it like rays, as if glowing. To her, it was no longer a metaphor. It was the very blade now lying in an evidence bag under a deputy's arm. Detective Moore sealed the knife and cloth, logging them under temporary numbers. She held the damp papers gingerly, spreading them beneath a lamp once back at the station. Most had dissolved into pulp, but a few letters were still visible. Words of a letter never sent, signed with a name from the Boyd family. The ink had bled into unreadable shadows, yet the outline of a plea could be felt in its broken curves. Rumor and fact collided again. Some said the box was proof of a ritual buried to bind silence. Others called it a clumsy attempt to hide a crime in plain sight. Moore saw only fragments: rust, cloth, ink, each a whisper pulled from the soil. That night, the Carter home was quieter than it had been in days. Mary sat with Daniel in the living room, the diary between them. She turned to a page near the end, where Emily had written, "If the knife sleeps, what wakes when it is found?" The question now felt like prophecy. Lantern light flickered across the old Polaroid pinned to the wall, the blurred knife on a barroom floor echoing the real one unearthed in mud. Generations apart, yet bound by the same outline of steel. The box, once hidden beneath earth, now sat locked in the evidence room. Deputies swore they heard the hinges creak, though no one touched it. And in the Carter house, the diary lay open, its inked question hovering in the lamplight like a shadow that refused to fade. The rusted blade shimmered faintly, as if dreaming beneath its plastic seal. The discovery of the rusted box did not end the search. It deepened it. The bridge, already a place of rumor, became the axis around which the town revolved. People gathered along the banks at dusk, staring across the water as though expecting the river itself to give answers. The Carter family felt the weight of eyes whenever they stepped outside. Some neighbors offered food, others only silence, but all seemed to measure their words as though every sentence carried history. Detective Moore spent the next days in county archives, requesting files older than many of the deputies she worked beside. She traced the knife found in the box against autopsy photos from 1977. The dimensions of the blade matched the wounds recorded in brittle reports: 3 strikes to the chest, 1 to the shoulder. The victim was listed as Charles Boyd, an uncle to Clara. His name had been buried in a stack of yellowing papers no one in town cared to revisit. The forensic echo was unmistakable, yet belief did not bend to paperwork. Franklin Boyd's story grew each time he told it, now claiming the knife had been hidden as part of a pact between families, a way to keep violence contained. His porch became a gathering spot for younger men who carried the tale forward, adding new shadows to it. By the time word circled back to the Carters, the story sounded less like memory and more like ritual. A blade buried, a bridge marked, a debt unpaid. In Emily's diary, another layer revealed itself. Between lines of ordinary teenage thoughts, homework, friendships, fleeting hopes, she had copied verses of an old folk ballad. The song described a sleeping edge that waits in soil until called again. Mary Carter read those words aloud one evening, her voice breaking over each line. To her, they were simply Emily's curiosity, but to others, they sounded like a prophecy fulfilled. At the station, Detective Moore pinned the diary excerpt beside the Polaroid and the newspaper. On the board, the symbol of the knife appeared 3 times, once in a photograph of a barroom floor, once in a drawing in a teenage diary, and once as an artifact lifted from mud. It was no longer private, no longer cultural rumor. It was evidence threaded across decades. Still, the trail to Emily herself remained dim. Deputies dragged sections of the river, nets pulling branches, tires, and cans to the surface. No trace of the girl appeared. Each empty haul only thickened the mist of speculation. Some residents claimed to have seen her shadow moving along the ridge at night. a pale figure crossing fields. One man swore he heard her voice in the wind, calling his name. He told the story twice at the diner, then a third time, until it spread as though it were fact. Mary avoided the diner. She sat at home, reading the diary under the same lamp, the words pressing heavier with each page. She wondered how much of Emily's writing had been research, how much had been warning. One entry described meeting Clara again, cryptic and short. "She knows more than she says. The bridge won't let her sleep." Detective Moore underlined that passage in her notes, then stared at Clara's name circled in ink on the wall chart. Still, she resisted pressure to act. The town wanted a villain, but Moore knew premature answers could sink a case faster than silence. For now, she gathered fragments, ink on paper, rust on steel, rumor in the air. The valley remained wrapped in fog each evening. The bridge rose out of it like a spine of bone, its boards sagging, its nails sighing when the wind pressed hard. Lanterns left by searchers burned weakly along the path, their flames wavering before dying in the damp. And in the Carter home, Mary closed the diary and pressed her forehead against its cover. She whispered her daughter's name once, as if the book itself might carry the sound across the dark to wherever Emily was. On the riverbank, the mud held the shape of shovels, the soil refusing to close again. The bridge stood in silence, its outline dissolving into the fog. By the second week, exhaustion had set in. Searchers came and went, their numbers thinning. But the river and the bridge remained under constant watch. Patrol cars idled near the old span, headlights cutting through mist, while locals leaned against fences to trade theories. Everyone seemed certain now that the feud was alive again. The only question was who had lit the spark. That answer seemed to arrive on a damp afternoon when a man named Harold Jenkins walked into the sheriff's office. He was a mechanic from the edge of town, known more for gossip than truth, but his story drew instant attention. He claimed he had seen two figures near the bridge the night Emily vanished. One was unmistakably her. The other, he said, was Clara Boyd. The two had been arguing, voices raised enough that even the river could not drown them out. He said he heard Emily shout something about the box before storm clouds rolled overhead. Sheriff Harmon listened carefully, noting the time Harold provided, close to 9 p.m. It aligned with the gap in Emily's phone records, the hour when the device went silent. Detective Moore pressed for details, but Harold's recollection wavered. First he said Clara pulled at Emily's arm. Then he corrected himself, saying it might have been the other way around. Still, the seed had been planted. Clara's name, already whispered, now became the center of speculation. Belief surged ahead, carried by rumor. At the diner, patrons spoke as though Clara's guilt was certain. Some said her family had raised her on the old feud, that she had been taught the Carter name was poison. Others claimed she had been jealous of Emily, though no one could say why. Each story grew in the telling. By evening, people were watching the Boyd property from the road, headlights slowing as cars rolled past. Detective Moore, however, was cautious. She reviewed a different source, footage from a gas station camera 2 miles from the bridge. The image was blurred, grainy, filmed through rain streaking the lens. Still, a small sedan could be seen passing by at 8:57 p.m., heading toward the river. The vehicle's outline resembled Clara's, but the license plate was unreadable. To Moore, it was a fragment, not a conclusion. To the town, it was proof. Mary Carter heard the news with a mixture of dread and disbelief. She returned to the diary, searching for Clara's name. On one folded page, Emily had written it in the margin, circled twice. Beneath, she scrawled, "She says the bridge talks. She says it keeps." The handwriting was hurried, nearly illegible, as though written in motion. Mary pressed her palm to the page until the ink blurred beneath plastic. That night, rain fell again, steady and cold. Deputies patrolled the bridge, their lights sweeping across the broken boards. Each gust of wind rattled loose nails. Each ripple of the river looked like movement. In the Carter home, Mary sat with Daniel, their faces lit only by a lamp. They spoke little. Every few minutes, Mary's eyes shifted to the diary, open to the page with Clara's name, as if the book itself accused her. Outside, the town's judgment moved faster than the case. In the shadows beyond the porch, Mary swore she saw figures pausing on the road, watching the house, waiting for the story to end. The blurred frame of a car glimmered in the rain-streaked footage. The valley seemed to hold its breath. Every conversation bent toward the same name now. Every whisper at the grocery line. Every glance across the church parking lot. Clara Boyd, once just another girl in town, had become the shadow at the center of it all. Her family shut their doors, curtains drawn against the stares of neighbors. Franklin Boyd barked at anyone who lingered on his porch, but even his defiance could not erase the feeling that the old feud was awake again, demanding another sacrifice. Detective Moore moved carefully. Rumor might have been satisfied to brand Clara guilty, but evidence was still thin. The diary pointed, the witness spoke, and the blurred image hinted, but none of it was enough. Moore returned to the bridge with a smaller team, determined to look again where the soil had already been disturbed. This time they dug not at the pilings, but 10 yards beyond, where the earth sagged in a shape too square to be natural. The shovels hit harder soil, and then softer pockets that gave way quickly. Within an hour, the team struck fabric. They pulled gently, water seeping around the edges. A plastic bag emerged, caked in mud. Inside was a backpack, faded and soaked through. The zipper was jammed, but when forced open, it revealed notebooks, pens, and small personal items that Mary recognized instantly. It was Emily's. Among them lay the diary, swollen with water, its pages puffed and warped. Yet the ink on the last page still bled through. "I don't think they'll let me leave." Mary collapsed when shown the bag, clutching it as if the weight itself were her daughter. But the excavation did not stop there. Beneath the backpack, the earth gave way to something heavier, a form wrapped in cloth, the outline unmistakable. Deputies called for quiet as the body was lifted slowly from the soil. The valley's silence seemed to deepen, broken only by the scrape of shovels. Emily's remains, preserved by mud and cold, came into light for the first time since that night. The air shifted in that moment. Belief, rumor, and denial cracked apart. The search was no longer for a missing girl. It was for a killer. Forensic technicians worked under floodlights. The coroner confirmed what the blade already whispered. Multiple stab wounds, delivered with the same dimensions as the knife recovered from the box. One strike had pierced bone, another had severed muscle. It was a violence both personal and deliberate. The town recoiled. Some insisted it proved the Boyd curse was real, that Clara had been destined to repeat the act of her uncle. Others clung to the idea that someone else had placed her at the scene, that she was only a vessel for older sins. Rumor reached for supernatural language, while fact etched itself in clinical lines on a report. Detective Moore brought Clara in for questioning. She sat small in the interrogation room, hands clasped, voice shaking. She admitted to meeting Emily that night. She admitted they had argued, though she would not reveal about what. She insisted Emily walked away from her toward the bridge. She denied following, denied touching her, denied knowing anything about the backpack or the shallow grave. But Moore had more than words now. The knife carried fingerprints, faint but present, matching Clara's. The backpack carried smears of mud consistent with the soil near her family's property. The forensic evidence pressed harder than rumor ever could. Mary Carter sat in the gallery of that interview, watching through the one-way glass. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, to hold up the diary and force Clara to read aloud what Emily had written. Instead, she pressed her hands against the glass until her reflection blurred. The diary, once a private journal, had become the spine of the case. Its entries no longer sounded like musings. They sounded like testimony written in advance, as though Emily had known her own story would end in these pages. Night fell heavy over the town as the body was moved to the coroner's office. Deputies stood guard at the bridge, though there was nothing left to protect. Lanterns flickered in the mist, their light too weak to chase away the feeling that the river had taken part in what happened. At the Carter house, Mary placed the diary beside the backpack on the kitchen table. She touched the warped cover, her thumb resting on the final line. She whispered Emily's name again and again until her voice broke. Daniel stood behind her, his hand on her shoulder, silent in his grief. The Boyd property remained dark. No lights in the windows, no sound from the yard. But the town's eyes never left it, watching as though waiting for smoke to rise. And in the evidence room, the diary lay sealed in plastic beside the rusted knife. Two artifacts drawn together by decades, their pages in steel whispering the same story of blood and silence. The backpack's zipper gaped open, spilling a diary swollen with river mud. The arrest came at dawn. Patrol cars rolled up the narrow lane to the Boyd property, tires crunching gravel, radios murmuring through static. Mist hung over the yard, and chickens scattered as deputies stepped out with warrants in hand. Clara Boyd was led to the cruiser in silence, her wrists cuffed before the watching eyes of neighbors who had gathered at the fence line. Some whispered prayers, others muttered curses. Franklin Boyd shouted from the porch that it was all a setup, that the Carters had poisoned the town against them for 40 years. His voice cracked as the door slammed shut on his granddaughter. At the station, Clara kept repeating the same line. She had argued with Emily, yes, but she had not killed her. She insisted the knife was not hers, that she had only touched it once when shown by an older relative as part of some family story. The diary's entries, she said, were just the ramblings of a girl chasing shadows. But the facts mounted in stacks before her. Fingerprints on the blade, mud from her yard matching samples near the grave, the blurred image of her car heading toward the bridge that night. The courtroom filled quickly when the hearing was set. Wooden benches creaked under the weight of townspeople, reporters, and family members who had avoided each other for decades but now sat only feet apart. On one table lay the evidence sealed in plastic: the rusted knife, the waterlogged backpack, and the diary, swollen but intact enough to be read. When the prosecutor placed the diary on the stand, the room fell still. A page was projected on the wall. Emily's handwriting scrawled across it. "I don't think they'll let me leave." The words felt like prophecy. Mary Carter covered her face. Daniel gripped the bench so hard his knuckles whitened. Clara's attorney argued the diary was no confession, that it proved nothing about who had struck the blows. He painted it as teenage melodrama, echoes of old tales overheard at family tables. Yet the jury watched the pages turn, each entry closer to the end, each line heavier than the last. The diary had begun as a girl's private object, then become a cultural relic whispered about by the town, and now it stood as forensic artifact, evidence labeled Exhibit A1. The community fractured along lines as old as the feud itself. Some stood with the Carters, demanding justice for Emily. Others rallied to the Boyds, insisting Clara was a scapegoat, punished for sins not hers. In the diner, arguments broke out, voices rising until plates rattled. At church pews, people shifted away from one another. The valley no longer felt like one place. It felt like two shadows overlapping, neither willing to vanish. Detective Moore testified calmly, her voice steady as she traced the evidence chain. The knife matched wounds from 1977 and from Emily. The fingerprints on its handle matched Clara's. The grave soil matched samples from the Boyd property. Each detail added weight until rumor itself seemed to buckle under the strain. Yet even then, some jurors cast glances at Clara with doubt in their eyes, as though still haunted by whispers of curses and rituals. Mary Carter refused to speak publicly. She kept her focus on the diary, reading its lines during recess, whispering Emily's words under her breath. To her, the book was not just evidence. It was her daughter's voice, frozen in ink. When closing arguments ended, silence pressed down so hard the wood of the benches seemed to creak in protest. The jury filed out, their footsteps echoing down the hall. Hours passed before they returned, faces drawn, eyes hollow. The verdict was read aloud in the stillness. Guilty. Life imprisonment. Gasps filled the courtroom. Franklin Boyd cursed loudly, his words drowned by the judge's gavel. Mary Carter wept quietly, her hand pressed against the diary's plastic sleeve. Detective Moore allowed herself a single deep breath before returning her gaze to the evidence table. The courtroom doors opened, letting in a draft that stirred the pages of the diary ever so slightly. as if the book itself exhaled. The diary lay open under glass, its final line trembling in unseen air. When the verdict echoed through the valley, the town did not settle. Instead, it split further, the old lines carved deeper. Some residents placed candles on the Carter porch, murmuring prayers for Emily. Others drove slowly past the Boyd house at night, headlights sweeping across boarded windows, muttering that an injustice had been done. In both households, silence pressed heavier than words. Mary Carter moved through her days as though underwater. The trial had given her what the law could offer, yet the emptiness in her home remained. Emily's room was left untouched, clothes still folded in drawers, posters still taped to the walls. Only the diary was gone, locked away now in the evidence archive. The absence of that book left the room colder. Mary often dreamed of turning its pages again, as if her daughter's voice might be waiting between the lines. Detective Moore closed her files with the caution of someone who knew cases never truly ended. She had logged every fragment, photographed each object, signed each chain of custody line. The knife, catalogued now as Exhibit A2, rested in a sealed container. The diary, pressed flat under glass, bore the label Exhibit A1. In official records, they were items of proof. In the hearts of the families, they were relics of grief. The Boyd clan receded behind locked doors. Franklin's voice no longer carried across porches. His health faltered in the months that followed. Clara, confined far from the valley, wrote letters that arrived rarely, filled with denials, insisting she had been caught in the undertow of history she did not choose. Some in town believed her, repeating the claim that the evidence was planted. Others dismissed it as another attempt to keep the feud alive. The bridge remained standing, though no one crossed it now. The county posted warning signs, but the structure seemed beyond law. Boards sagged, iron bled rust, and vines crept up its rails. At night, mist still gathered thick around its span. Travelers swore the shape of a girl could be seen there, just for a moment, before dissolving into fog. Months after the trial, Mary requested the diary back. A judge permitted its return, and it was placed in her hands inside a glass case, sealed forever. She set it in a quiet corner of the living room, beneath a framed photo of Emily smiling in the summer sun. Visitors who came to pay respects often paused before it, whispering as though the book itself might answer. The symbol had completed its journey. What began as a private notebook became a vessel of rumor, then a ritual echo, then a courtroom artifact. Now it stood as both memory and warning. Its pages, warped and stained, carried the weight of two histories, the feud of 1977 and the silence of 2017. On winter nights, Mary sat before the glass case, the hum of the furnace filling the house. She would sometimes swear the pages shifted, though no hand touched them, as if the diary breathed in rhythm with the house itself. Daniel avoided that corner of the room, unwilling to watch his mother speak softly to the book. Detective Moore left the valley in early spring. Her final report closed with a single line, "Justice delivered, though the wound remains." She knew that what had been resolved in court could never erase the impression of rumor, belief, and fear that lingered in the community. Files might be shelved, but silence held its own record. And so the town carried on, split by fences both visible and unseen, bound by the memory of a girl who walked into the night and did not return. In the Carter living room, the diary rested in its glass box, a single page half-turned as if caught by breath no one claimed. The final line flickered under glass, trembling like a pulse that would not fade.